Just going back to the subject regarding the impact of feminism on Muslims just generally, even within the Muslim world. Let's just go back to Europe and let's look at the roots of feminism in Europe. Sister Fatima, you claim that there's a historic source of feminism in Europe due to oppression of women by the Christian church. Do you want to give us a bit of an understanding around that particular subject area?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could say that, you know, because there have been different stages and shades of feminism throughout history, you know, there will have been many different things that contributed to feminism, you know, and feminist ideology. However, one of the things that I found very, that seemed very, very clear to me when I was researching this subject was just as atheism and secularism came about very much, you know, due to the oppression of the Christian church in Europe, you know, over time. I believe that feminism also finds its roots in the oppression that was meted out by the Christian church in Europe. I mean, one of the very shocking kind of things that you can find out about is the witch hunts that took place during the 15th to 17th century that were sanctioned by the Catholic Church all over Europe, including America as well, where, you know, women, predominantly women, 85% of people accused of being witches. And by the way, being a witch could be, it was a very arbitrary term, you know, you could be accused of being a witch or a devil worshipper for any kind of weird behavior that people saw in you and reported from you. It's estimated between 40,000 and 100,000 women were killed in Europe due to these witch hunts, right? And there were no trials, you know, the women were thrown into rivers and literally burnt at the stake. And this was sanctioned by the church. Also going right back, if we look at the fact that, you know, women didn't really have access to the Bible. Men didn't have access to the Bible either, you know, the average man on the street. But women especially were not encouraged or not allowed to learn the Bible. You know, the whole story in the Bible of Satan, or Shaitan, you know, and Adam and Eve and Hawa in the garden blames Eve as the primary reason or the primary source or person responsible for the downfall of man. And that's very clear in the Bible. In Genesis 3, Adam blames Eve, and God tells Eve that all the pain and, you know, any difficulty that she has in life, especially during childbirth, are due to the sin of Eve, right? And again, celibacy, so in other words, staying away from women, especially, was seen as being the peak of piety for a man, right? So these things and other, you know, forms of oppression, certain basic rights not being given to women, like the right to property, the right to their own legal identity, things that Muslims were not an issue, you know, things that Islam gave women, were big problems for women in the West and especially in Europe. And I believe that this kind of oppression and long-term oppression led to, you know, the beginnings of women, you know, formulating, you know, the first waves of feminism. So that's the background that I was referring to.
Okay. So when we look at the concept of oppression in early sort of history of Europe, when it comes to women, somebody can present the same kind of argument about Muslim communities and the Muslim world, and there is a sense of oppression of women in the Muslim world. Now, surely women and girls should live with respect, kindness, love, support, and the full measure of rights all people deserve. So, Danielle, is this happening in the Muslim community in the Muslim world? Is there such thing as female oppression, and how should women stand up to this?
Well, I think we have to look at where this question is coming from and the context in which it's being articulated. I would, with all due respect, push back on some of what Sister Fatima has mentioned about the treatment of women in European society. When we look at something like witchcraft, for example, there were also more men who were accused and convicted of practicing magic. Okay, so this is not something that specifically affected women to the exclusion of men. Men were also seen as possibly practicing dark arts and magic, and were also convicted of this within medieval Europe and even in Muslim societies as well. And the problem that I have, and I mentioned this idea of patriarchy, the problem I have with the thesis that when we look at historically, there's been systematic mistreatment of women by men. This is a very problematic thesis, and I don't think actual historical fact justifies that thesis, because many of the examples that are cited are very selective. And this is not to say that women have been treated perfectly at all times and places. Not at all. Certainly there is abuse of women and taking of their rights, but it's not something that is specific to that gender. There's also the mistreatment of men. There's also the taking of men's rights in different scenarios and contexts. And I can talk about this for hours, but just to make it more succinct, is feminism gives us this very this specific lens in which to understand and very selectively look at practices in the world and focus on the plight of women to the exclusion of men. And the other point that I often mention is that this idea that women have systematically been oppressed since the dawn of time is very insulting to women, because it says that women have not been able to match wits with men. Women have not been able throughout thousands of years to understand that, oh, we are the victims of this systematic subjugation and we're being taken advantage of, we're being abused, and we haven't even realized this, let alone overturn those systems of oppression. And only within the past 100 years have women realized that this patriarchy, this systematic oppression exists, and only within this modern period have we discovered this grand conspiracy to subjugate women. So this is a very problematic thesis. It has great negative implications for all organized religion. And in fact, first wave feminists from the very beginning had their target on religion, to attack religion, and especially Christianity, especially Islam. So we have to be aware of this and not buy into ideas and perspectives that don't have a basis in reality and are contrary to our religion.
But I think, if I may, Dr. Rafaqat, yes, I just wanted to make the point that what I'm trying to highlight is that as Muslims, we have to realize that feminism emerged in Europe because of historical reasons as well. You know, we can't deny the fact that there were specific historical things that were happening in Europe. So, for example, even just take the world wars, right? And the fact that millions of men were dead and now women were needed for the workforce, right? These factors do add up to explain to us somewhat, you know, why it was that feminism emerged in Europe and why Muslims never felt the need for feminism, because, you know, the rights that were denied women in Europe were already given to Muslim women, many of them. And, you know, Muslim women on the whole did not have this kind of reaction. So I don't think it's necessarily buying into the narrative to say that there were certain specific historical things that were happening in Europe that we as Muslims need to realize, feminism was kind of a reaction to. I don't think there's anything kind of conspiratorial in highlighting that.
Well, I absolutely agree with you that there were historical factors within Europe that led to the rise of feminism. Where we see historically the first mention of women's rights and the mistreatment of women was by European colonizers. We see the first people who are really raising the issue of women's rights, women's education, women's dress are actually white colonialists like John Stuart Mill or Hobbes or Condorcet or Montesquieu or Voltaire. These were really the first feminists, and they were raising these issues of women's rights to attack indigenous societies, including Muslim societies. They're using this as a justification to colonize and to civilize the Muslim world, because the Muslims are so backwards. The Muslims are mistreating their women. The Muslims are not allowing their women to dress in this European way, and instead Muslim women have to veil themselves. Instead, Muslim women have to primarily be in the home domestic context. These were critiques that the colonizers used, European colonizers, to attack and colonize the Muslim world and also other indigenous populations within China, the Native Americans, the Aboriginals in Australia. This is where we find the first expressions of women's rights within the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And then only at the end of the 19th century were those kinds of discourses co-opted by the first wave feminists to discuss the place of women in European society, right? That's the actual historical progression. The first expression of women's rights was used by these men, European male colonizers.
Okay, I mean, we've clearly discussed the historical context of feminism and how that's been portrayed, even by academics today. Just going into the manifestations of how feminism presents today in contemporary time, I just want to reflect on something, Sister Zara, that you mentioned, that you debated the feminist journalist and self-proclaimed political lesbian Julie Bindel, who stated that if she could, she would put all men into a camp with wardens where their female relatives could check them out like library books. And you talk about this concept of reverse sexism. But women cannot be sexist because they do not hold political, economic, and institutional power, as has been explained earlier by some of these feminists. Do you want to give us a bit of an idea about the idea of reverse sexism and this argument that women cannot be sexist because they do not hold political, economic, and institutional power?
Sure. And to sort of build on what's been discussed already, so to tie this in with the idea of patriarchy and the idea that men have held power in society to the detriment of women for a long time. And also just to connect with what was discussed earlier before going deeper into this question, there are a lot of parts of particularly Western history where we look at how women were treated, and we say it's, from one perspective, it is easy for a group to look at that and say, yes, look, women were oppressed. The fact is, in those periods, as in today's period, it's not necessarily a case of oppression, but rather ignorance. So where there is ignorance, rights of many groups of society will be denied. So, for example, when we talk about how before, in Europe, women couldn't own property, whereas in Islam they could, the flip side of it is that in Europe, when, particularly in England, when women couldn't own property, it also meant that they couldn't actually ever be taken to court or have any debts, because their husbands would be the ones that would have to be taken to court for any monies that the women owed. And if there were any legal repercussions for anything like that, the men would be the one that would have to face the brunt of it, not the women. So there are two sides to that, and there isn't that isn't to say that that is the right way for things to be at all. It's just to say that when this narrative is put together about how one group of society is hard done by, we have to be, and I think perhaps this is what Brother Daniel is suggesting, we have to scrutinize that for our own benefit. So we need to look at whatever these claims are, and we can even put history to side for the moment, and let's look at what we're dealing with today, what is really going on. When people do come to us with grievances, whether it's men saying that, you know, we want to earn a living for our families, but we can't because there's too much corruption or tyranny, you know, not because they want money so that they can go on a yoga retreat. You know, they want to be able to provide for their families. If they can't, you know, because of either, you know, in the Muslim world, because of discord, it's unsafe, there's too much corruption, you know, they're prevented from that. Oftentimes, you know, young boys are going out to earn, to provide for, you know, very large families if their fathers are no longer around, because for whatever reason, you know, if because of war or, you know, all kinds of circumstance. And as a result, then obviously women's rights are also, you know, denied. Just to get to the heart of why we're having this discussion. So in Islam, a woman has, for example, the right to be provided for, but that's not going to happen if a husband can't get the work or is unable to actually earn because there's too much corruption in society. In Islam, you know, the woman, as does the man, they have, you know, she has a right to go out and seek an education, but she can't do that if the streets are unsafe because of, you know, because there is, you know, it's basically a battle zone. You know, in Islam, a woman has a great many number of rights, but they are hinged and connected with men's rights and with men's roles as well. So we have rights and duties to each other. And the problem arises is when we magnify on one group of society's rights, and we ignore the fact that we are interconnected in how we live and how we structure and how we achieve these rights at all. When we ignore the fact that one person's right only exists when another person has a duty to fulfill it, we're not answering the question. All we're doing is aggravating the sentiment or the feeling of dissatisfaction that people have. If we are just demanding rights, as it were, if we are just demanding rights and not talking about the infrastructure that is necessary to be put in place so that this domino effect of injustice doesn't occur, then again, we're not really answering the question. And in the West, I mean, as we mentioned earlier, this is manifested in a great many varieties of feminisms. So you have social feminism, ecofeminism, you know, intersectional feminism, and then you have slightly more radical feminisms, of which, per your question, Julie Bindel, you know, is a school of, is a member of that sort of camp of feminism. And so she had made this comment, which you mentioned, which is that if she could, she would put all men into a camp with wardens where their female relatives could check them out like library books. Now, of course, she said afterwards that, and she's not the first to make such outlandish statements, they're pretty common, particularly amongst, you know, the more, what they call themselves as radical feminists, but really it's kind of a slope and they all end up going in that direction at some point anyway. She did mention after that, you know, oh, she was only joking. But the point is that a man couldn't make the same joke. Now, if a man had said, for example, if he could, he would put all women into a camp with wardens where their male relatives could check them out like library books, and then afterwards said that he was only joking, he would be socially hung, drawn and quartered anyway. It wouldn't matter. Now, the reason this is interesting is because this brings up the question of something called reverse sexism. So often, feminists and other members of similar political ideology you know, identity politic sort of groups, they will say that there's no such thing as reverse sexism. And what they mean is that it's not possible for a woman to be sexist towards a man because men are not victims of something like a patriarchy. So they say that women, because they've been subject to, according to them, this sort of, you know, this political, economic and institutional power, if women are prejudiced, it doesn't count as sexism because it doesn't change the status quo. This is what they would claim. Now, it's funny because, you know, sexism is sexism, discrimination is discrimination. And for Muslims in particular, you know, we live our lives trying to have the concept of accountability at the forefront of our minds. It's not that, oh, when is it okay to be discriminatory? When is it okay to be sexist? These types of conversations come up in, you know, in amongst, you know, in discussions amongst those who, you know, who subscribe to different identity politics. But for Muslims, this is something that we need to be very wary of. And this is why I decided to write about that. And the point here is that being a member, even if we want to, whatever the group is, whether it's racial oppression, whatever type of oppression it is, as a Muslim, being a member of an oppressed class, whether it's for wealth, race, gender, even if we want to go with that, whatever the reason is, as Muslims, it doesn't give us license to then inflict injustice against others or to assert superiority over members of what we perceive to be the oppressor class. So being, you know, if we are an individual in society where we're hard done by for whatever reason, it doesn't exempt us from our own life purpose as Muslims. It doesn't exempt us from our own duty as Muslims to do what we can for justice and for our own accountability, so that we don't have to answer for that. And it's put much better than me, obviously. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals in the Quran, for example, a very interesting conversation between a weak group, or a group that, you know, that is described as oppressed, and an overbearing group, or an oppressor group. And the weak group and the overbearing group have both been condemned in the hereafter, according to this passage. And the verses are in chapter 34, verses 31 to 32, and it goes as follows. Allah says in the Quran, "If you could see when the wrongdoers are made to stand before their Lord, refuting each other's words, those who were held weak will say to those who are overbearing, if not for you, we would have been believers. And those who are overbearing will say to those who are weak, did we avert you from guidance after it had come to you? Rather, you were criminals." So in other words, these two groups, they will wrangle with each other, they will argue with each other while standing before their creator. And the oppressed group will be trying to blame the oppressor, the overbearing group. And the oppressor will then turn around and remind the oppressed that, okay, you were oppressed, but you could still have followed divine guidance in your own behavior, saying, you know, we didn't make you do wrong just because we were doing wrong. And, you know, interestingly, the Quran describes both groups in this passage as wrongdoers. The word literally uses zalimun, which means, you know, oppressors. So this is something that is really important to flag, because sometimes when we are dealing with situations where we are talking about, you know, cases of what we would describe as injustice, and how to you know, combat that, how to deal with that, how to address that. Sometimes people think it's okay to then reverse the discrimination that they have experienced in order to try to, quote unquote, level the playing field, or to say that, well, it happened to us, we're in such a weak position now that, you know, this won't ever cause any real harm. In effect, it's just venting. Well, this is not what, as Muslims, we are allowed to do. We have to make sure that we deal with things in the way that the Quran has described, and in a way that doesn't give rise to any kind of residual feelings of anger from the other side. So for example, going back to, you know, the likes of Julie Bindel, etc., because feminism in the West has been so aggressive, and because it's at the core of its ideology, it ends up advocating for female privilege rather than to redress any perceived notions of injustice. Because of that, it's actually resulted in a counter movement in the West. So you have a lot of groups that describe themselves as men's rights activists. Even to some extremes, you have some amongst those who describe themselves as men going their own way, which means they want to live their lives without engaging with women at all, no marriage, nothing. So Islam doesn't want us to be swinging wildly on this pendulum. And when we feel that we can, you know, as the saying goes, when the oppressed becomes the oppressor, whether they're really oppressed, you know, we're not talking about that right now, but just in their own minds, if somebody is oppressed and they feel that they can then, you know, do the same in return, I mean, we have countless examples in our society of why this, when and why this goes wrong. Academics, philosophers, you know, Islamic philosophers and historians, Ibn Khaldun, so many people have noted that the oppressed often take on the guise of the oppressor because they think that that is what power looks like. They think that that is how to resolve their issues. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, no, you know, deal with things justly. When you encounter a problem, apply the solution that is measured, and not just for the sake of revenge, which often some feminist campaigns do end up resembling. So yeah, hopefully it's a bit of an explanation on how Islam answers the question, is it ever okay to be discriminatory? And the answer is no. Okay, we've approached, well, we're approaching 5 o'clock here in UK. So from 5 o'clock onwards, we were hoping to get in a number of questions from the audience. What I will do is, some of these questions are in essence related to some of the questions I had put to yourself, or I was thinking of putting to yourselves from panel discussion. So I'll refer to one question, which is